War destroys nations. It levels cities, ends lives, and reshapes the fate of entire civilizations. Empires collapse, borders shift, and millions of lives are changed forever. But for some, war has never been only destruction. For more than 2 centuries, powerful industrial families have quietly built vast fortunes from the machinery of conflict. Cannons, rifles, explosives, warships, aircraft, and missiles. Every major war in modern history has also fueled a massive industry behind the front lines. Because long before soldiers step onto the battlefield, weapons must first be built. Behind the battlefields stood factories, behind the armies stood corporations, and behind many of those corporations stood dynasties. From the steel empire of the Krupp family in Germany, whose artillery armed European armies, to the explosive inventions of Alfred Nobel, which revolutionized both construction and warfare, to the vast defense industries of Britain, America, and modern global arms manufacturers. These families and companies helped build the weapons that shaped modern warfare. Some viewed them as patriots, industrialists, who strengthened their nations during times of conflict. Others saw something far darker. Critics called them merchants of death, arguing that enormous profits could be made whenever nations went to war. Yet regardless of how they were judged, their influence on modern history cannot be ignored, because behind many of the wars that reshaped the world stood powerful industries and the families who built them. This is the story of the dynasties who turned war into fortune, and how their empires helped shape the modern world. For most of human history, war was fought with weapons made by hand. Before the modern industrial age, the tools of warfare were produced by skilled craftsmen working in small workshops. Blacksmiths forged swords, spears, and armor. Cannon makers cast heavy artillery pieces using traditional techniques that had changed little over centuries. Armies depended on networks of local artisans who produced weapons slowly and in limited numbers. Even the most powerful kingdoms faced strict limitations on how many weapons they could produce. Manufacturing was labor-intensive, resources were scarce, and transportation systems were slow. As a result, wars were often constrained by the practical limits of production. But during the late 18th and 19th centuries, a technological revolution began transforming the world. It was known as the Industrial Revolution. New machines, advanced metallurgy, and improved manufacturing techniques dramatically increased the ability of societies to produce goods. Factories replaced workshops. Steam engines powered machines that could operate faster and more efficiently than human labor alone. Industries such as textiles, railways, and steel manufacturing expanded rapidly across Europe and North America. Soon, these same innovations began transforming the production of weapons. Steel production improved dramatically, allowing manufacturers to create stronger and more reliable artillery. Precision engineering made it possible to produce rifles and ammunition in large quantities, with consistent quality. Factories equipped with modern machinery could now produce weapons on a scale that had never existed before. For the first time in history, entire industries were dedicated to the production of military equipment. Weapons manufacturing was no longer the domain of individual craftsmen. It had become a large-scale industrial operation. Governments quickly recognized the importance of these new capabilities. Modern armies required enormous quantities of equipment: rifles for soldiers, artillery for battlefield support, ammunition for sustained combat, and increasingly sophisticated military technology. Industrial production made it possible to supply these demands. Factories began producing thousands, and eventually millions, of weapons. At the same time, railways and steamships revolutionized transportation, allowing military equipment to be moved across continents with unprecedented speed. Nations that embraced industrial manufacturing gained significant advantages in military power. War was no longer simply a contest between armies. It was becoming a contest between industrial systems. Countries with stronger factories, better engineers, and greater manufacturing capacity could equip larger armies and sustain longer conflicts. Industrial strength became directly linked to military strength. This transformation also changed the role of private industry. Weapons production was no longer managed solely by governments. Instead, powerful private companies began competing for military contracts. Industrialists built factories capable of producing rifles, artillery, explosives, and ammunition on an enormous scale. These companies often operated across national borders, selling weapons to multiple governments. As international tensions increased during the 19th century, demand for military equipment grew rapidly. European powers were expanding their empires, competing for territory and influence across the globe. Armies needed modern weapons to maintain their dominance. For manufacturers, this demand created new opportunities. Industrialists who could produce reliable and advanced weapons quickly became extremely valuable to governments. Contracts for military equipment were lucrative, and successful companies often secured long-term agreements to supply national armies. The result was the emergence of a new type of business, the arms industry. Factories dedicated to producing military equipment became major economic institutions. Some companies grew so large that they employed tens of thousands of workers and operated vast industrial complexes. These companies did more than manufacture weapons. They drove technological innovation. Engineers working for arms manufacturers developed new materials, improved explosives, advanced artillery systems, and increasingly sophisticated military technologies. Imanicas's innovations, first developed for warfare, later influenced civilian industries as well. But this transformation also raised difficult questions. If war created enormous demand for weapons, then weapons manufacturers stood to profit whenever conflicts occurred. The relationship between industrial profit and military conflict became increasingly controversial. Some critics began arguing that powerful industrialists might benefit from the continuation of war. Others believed that strong arms industries were necessary to protect national security. Regardless of these debates, one reality was becoming clear. War was no longer simply a political struggle between nations. It had become a massive industrial enterprise. Factories produced rifles, artillery shells, and explosives in staggering quantities. Entire regions became centers of weapons manufacturing. Workers across multiple industries contributed to the production of military equipment, and for the first time in human history, war had become a global business. This new system would soon give rise to powerful industrial dynasties, families whose fortunes were built on the production of weapons that would shape the future of warfare. Among the most influential of these dynasties was a German industrial family, whose name would become synonymous with the power of modern artillery, the Krupp family. As the Industrial Revolution reshaped manufacturing across Europe, a new generation of industrialists began transforming the production of weapons. Among the most influential of these figures was a German businessman whose name would become synonymous with modern artillery and industrial power. His name was Alfred Krupp. Born in 1812 in the industrial city of Essen, Germany, Alfred Krupp inherited a small steel business founded by his father, Friedrich Krupp. At the time, the company was struggling financially and operated on a relatively modest scale. Steel production was still developing as an industry, and many early attempts to compete with established manufacturers had failed. But Alfred Krupp possessed a relentless determination and an extraordinary vision for the future of industrial manufacturing. From an early age, he focused on perfecting the production of high-quality cast steel, a material that was stronger and more durable than traditional iron. Steel had enormous potential in many industries, including railways, machinery, and construction. But Krupp soon realized that one of the most profitable applications of steel would be in the production of weapons. Artillery, in particular, was undergoing a major transformation during the 19th century. Traditional cannons made of bronze or iron were limited in both strength and accuracy. They could not withstand extremely high pressures, and their range and reliability were often restricted. Krupp believed that advanced steel manufacturing could solve these problems. Through years of experimentation and engineering innovation, he began producing steel artillery pieces that were stronger, more precise, and more durable than those produced by most competitors. The results were revolutionary. Krupp cannons could fire more powerful shells over greater distances while maintaining a higher level of reliability. Military leaders across Europe quickly recognized the advantages of these weapons. Soon, governments began placing large orders with Krupp's factories. As demand grew, Krupp expanded his industrial operations dramatically. In Essen, he constructed enormous steelworks capable of producing artillery, ammunition, and other military equipment on an unprecedented scale. The factory complex became one of the largest industrial sites in Europe, employing thousands of workers and operating with cutting-edge manufacturing technology. The Krupp company was no longer a small family business. It had become a major industrial empire. During the mid to late 19th century, Krupp artillery was exported to numerous countries across Europe and beyond. Governments seeking to modernize their armies often turned to Krupp for advanced weapon systems. The company's reputation for quality and reliability made its artillery highly sought after. Immanuel Krupp helped establish the model for the modern arms industry. Instead of relying on small workshops producing weapons individually, Krupp built enormous factories capable of manufacturing military equipment in large quantities. Industrial engineering, advanced metallurgy, and precision manufacturing became the foundation of this new system. Krupp's influence extended beyond technology. His company developed close relationships with governments and military leaders, particularly within the emerging German state. As Germany unified under Prussian leadership in the 19th century, Krupp artillery played a significant role in strengthening the country's military power. During conflicts such as the Franco-Prussian War of 1872-1871, Krupp cannons demonstrated their effectiveness on the battlefield. Their range, accuracy, and durability gave German forces a considerable advantage. Victories like these further strengthened the reputation of Krupp weapons. The company's success led many observers to describe it as the arsenal of Germany. By the late 19th century, the Krupp factories had become symbols of industrial strength and military capability. The company produced not only artillery but also armor plating, naval guns, and other advanced military equipment. At the same time, the Krupp family accumulated enormous wealth. Alfred Krupp himself became one of the most powerful industrialists in Europe. His influence extended into politics, economics, and international trade. The Krupp name became associated with both industrial innovation and military power. Yet the rise of the Krupp empire also sparked debate. Some critics argued that companies like Krupp had helped transform warfare into a large-scale industrial enterprise. By producing increasingly powerful weapons, arms manufacturers were contributing to the growing destructiveness of modern conflict. Others viewed Krupp very differently. Supporters saw him as a patriotic industrialist who had strengthened Germany's military and technological capabilities. They believed that strong industries were essential for national security in an increasingly competitive world. Regardless of these differing perspectives, the impact of Alfred Krupp's work was undeniable. He had helped pioneer a new system in which industrial manufacturing, technological innovation, and military power became closely intertwined. Weapons were no longer simply tools forged by craftsmen. They had become products of vast industrial networks factories, capable of supplying entire armies and shaping the outcome of wars. The Krupp Empire was one of the first and most powerful examples of this transformation. But it would not be the last. In another part of Europe, a different industrialist was developing a technology that would revolutionize both construction and warfare. His invention would create immense wealth and eventually lead him to seek redemption for the destructive power it unleashed. His name was Alfred Nobel. While industrialists like Alfred Krupp were transforming the production of steel weapons, another revolutionary invention was about to change the nature of warfare in an entirely different way. This transformation came through the work of a Swedish chemist and inventor named Alfred Nobel, born in 1833 in Stockholm, Sweden. Nobel grew up in a family closely connected to engineering and explosives technology. His father, Emmanuel Nobel, was an inventor and industrialist who worked on military equipment, including naval mines. From a young age, Alfred was exposed to scientific experimentation and the practical challenges of working with powerful chemicals. During the mid-19th century, one of the most important substances in explosive technology was nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin was an extremely powerful explosive liquid that had been discovered by Italian chemist Ascanio Sobrero in 1847, while its explosive potential was extraordinary. It was also dangerously unstable. Even small movements or temperature changes could trigger devastating explosions. For engineers and industrialists, nitroglycerin held enormous promise, but it was too dangerous to handle safely. Alfred Nobel became determined to solve this problem. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, he conducted numerous experiments, attempting to find a way to stabilize nitroglycerin so that it could be used more safely in construction and engineering projects. These experiments were often dangerous, and several accidents occurred during the process. In one tragic explosion at the family's laboratory in 1864, Nobel's younger brother and several workers were killed. Despite these setbacks, Nobel continued his research. Finally, in 1867, he developed a breakthrough invention. By mixing nitroglycerin with an absorbent material known as kies, Nobel created a stable compound that could be shaped into solid sticks and detonated in a controlled manner. He called this invention dynamite. Dynamite quickly transformed industries around the world. For construction companies, it became an incredibly useful tool. Tunnels could now be blasted through mountains, canals could be excavated more quickly, and railways could be built across difficult terrain. Mining companies also embraced the technology, using explosives to break apart rock formations and extract valuable minerals. These applications fueled enormous industrial expansion during the late 19th century. As demand for dynamite grew, Alfred Nobel built factories across Europe and North America to manufacture the explosive. His business empire expanded rapidly, and by the end of his career, he controlled more than 90 factories and laboratories in several countries. The invention made Nobel extraordinarily wealthy. However, dynamite also had another, far more destructive application. It transformed warfare. Explosives had long been used in military operations, but dynamite dramatically increased their power and effectiveness. Artillery shells, demolition charges, and other weapons became far more destructive as explosive technologies improved. Military engineers quickly recognized the potential of Nobel's invention. Explosives allowed armies to destroy fortifications, bridges, and defensive structures more efficiently than ever before. As industrial warfare expanded, explosives became an essential component of modern military technology. Although Nobel had originally envisioned dynamite primarily as a tool for construction and engineering, its military applications were impossible to ignore. This reality began to trouble him. Throughout his life, Nobel maintained a complex relationship with his inventions. On one hand, he was proud of the scientific breakthroughs he had achieved. His work had revolutionized engineering and helped build modern infrastructure around the world. But on the other hand, he was increasingly aware that his technology was also contributing to the destructive power of modern warfare. One event in particular had a profound impact on him. In 1888, a French newspaper mistakenly published Alfred Nobel's obituary after the death of his brother. The headline reportedly described him as the Merchant of Death, criticizing the inventor for creating explosives that had made killing more efficient in war. Reading his own obituary forced Nobel to confront how the world might remember him. The experience deeply disturbed him. Determined to reshape his legacy, Nobel made a remarkable decision. In his final will, he directed that the majority of his fortune be used to establish a set of international awards that would recognize individuals who made outstanding contributions to humanity. These awards became known as the Nobel Prizes. The prizes were designed to honor achievements in fields such as physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. Nobel hoped that these awards would encourage scientific progress, intellectual achievement, and efforts to promote peace around the world. When Alfred Nobel died in 1896, his fortune was used to create the Nobel Foundation, which continues awarding the prizes to this day. Today, the Nobel Prize is widely regarded as one of the most prestigious honors in the world. Yet the story of Alfred Nobel also highlights a deeper contradiction within the history of industrial innovation. Technologies developed for progress can also be used for destruction. Dynamite helped build railways, tunnels, and infrastructure that shaped the modern world. But it also played a role in increasing the destructive power of modern warfare. Nobel's life, therefore, reflects one of the central tensions of the industrial age. The same scientific breakthroughs that drive progress can also intensify conflict. And as the industrial production of weapons continued expanding, new companies and powerful industrial families would soon take the global arms industry to even greater scales. The business of war was still growing, and the next chapter would see the arms trade expand far beyond individual inventors in a vast international market, governments, and militaries around the world. By the late 19th century, the transformation of warfare was accelerating. The Industrial Revolution had already reshaped how weapons were produced, but another change was now taking place. Arms manufacturing was becoming an international business. What had once been limited to national workshops and government arsenals was now expanding into a global marketplace. Industrial companies were no longer producing weapons solely for their own countries. Instead, manufacturers began selling military equipment to multiple nations across Europe and beyond. Governments seeking to modernize their armies increasingly turned to private industrial companies capable of producing advanced weapons at scale. This shift created an entirely new industry, the global arms trade. Across Europe and North America, powerful manufacturing firms began competing for lucrative military contracts. industrialists realized that supplying weapons to governments could generate enormous profits, particularly as military technologies became more complex and expensive. Several countries quickly emerged as major centers of arms production. In Germany, companies such as Krupps had already built enormous factories capable of producing advanced artillery and military equipment. Their steel cannons and naval guns were exported to armies around the world. In Britain, firms like Vickers and Armstrong Whitworth developed powerful engineering capabilities that allowed them to manufacture warships, artillery, and military machinery. Britain's vast industrial infrastructure made it one of the leading arms exporters of the era. Meanwhile, in France, companies such as Schneider-Creusot became major producers of heavy artillery and military equipment. French arms manufacturers competed aggressively for contracts across Europe and the colonial world. In the United States, industrial firms were also expanding their involvement in weapons production. American manufacturers supplied rifles, ammunition, and other equipment to both domestic and international buyers. For governments, purchasing weapons from these companies offered significant advantages. Instead of building massive state-run factories, governments could rely on private industry to design and produce advanced military technology. Industrial firms possessed specialized engineers, modern machinery, and the financial resources needed to conduct research and development. As a result, the relationship between governments and arms manufacturers became increasingly close. Military officials consulted with industrial engineers about new weapon systems. Companies invested heavily in developing more powerful artillery, faster warships, and more efficient firearms. The arms industry was becoming a powerful engine of technological innovation. At the same time, the international arms market continued expanding. Weapons were exported across continents to nations seeking to strengthen their military forces. European powers sold arms to countries in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. As colonial empires expanded, military equipment was shipped to distant territories to support imperial control. The arms trade was no longer confined to regional conflicts. It had become a global enterprise. Industrial companies competed aggressively for contracts with foreign governments. International exhibitions and arms demonstrations allowed manufacturers to showcase their latest technologies. Military delegations traveled abroad to inspect factories and evaluate weapon systems before making purchasing decisions. In many cases, arms manufacturers acted almost like diplomats. Industrial representatives negotiated directly with foreign governments, offering favorable terms in exchange for large military contracts. These deals could involve not only weapons, but also training programs, maintenance services, and long-term supply agreements. For the companies involved, the financial rewards were immense. Military contracts often involved large quantities of weapons and extended over many years. Governments were willing to pay significant sums to ensure their armies possessed the most advanced technology available. As global tensions increased during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, demand for weapons grew even stronger. European powers were engaged in intense competition for influence and territory. Nations sought to build larger armies, stronger navies, and more powerful artillery systems. This military buildup created enormous opportunities for arms manufacturers. Factories expanded to meet the growing demand. Industrial workers produced rifles, shells, cannons, and explosives at increasing rates. Research laboratories developed new technologies that could give armies an advantage on the battlefield. The arms industry was no longer a small sector of the economy. It had become one of the most influential industries in the industrial world. At the center of this expanding market stood powerful industrial families. Dynasties such as the Krupps in Germany and the industrial families behind British and French arms manufacturers accumulated vast fortunes from military production. Their companies employed thousands of workers and operated enormous factories capable of supplying entire armies. These industrialists wielded significant economic and political influence. Their companies played critical roles in national defense, and governments often relied on them to maintain military readiness. As a result, the relationship between industry and politics became increasingly intertwined. Yet the expansion of the arms trade also sparked growing controversy. Critics argued that the global arms market encouraged military competition between nations. If companies profited from the sale of weapons, some feared they might benefit from rising tensions and conflict. These concerns led to debates about the role of private industry in warfare. Were arms manufacturers simply supplying necessary equipment for national defense, or were they contributing to the escalation of global conflict by promoting the sale of increasingly powerful weapons? These questions would become even more urgent in the years ahead, because as the 20th century approached, the world was entering a period of rising international tension. Military alliances were forming, rivalries between great powers were intensifying, and nations were expanding their armies and navies at unprecedented rates. The global arms industry was growing rapidly, and soon, the world would witness the consequences of this massive military buildup. In 1914, a conflict would erupt that would change warfare forever. A war so vast that it would mobilize entire economies, reshape global politics, and transform the arms industry into one of the most powerful forces in the modern world. It would be known as World War I. When World War I began in 1914, it transformed warfare on a scale the world had never seen before. Previous conflicts had certainly been destructive, but this war introduced something entirely new. Industrialized, total war. The conflict was not fought only by armies on the battlefield. Instead, entire nations mobilized their economies, factories, and populations in support of the war effort. For the first time in history, war demanded mass production on an enormous scale. Modern armies required millions of rifles, billions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of artillery pieces, and an endless supply of explosives. Machine guns, armored vehicles, and aircraft were becoming increasingly important parts of warfare. The technology of conflict had grown far more complex than the weapons used in earlier centuries. Meeting these demands required the full power of industrial manufacturing. Across Europe and North America, factories that had once produced civilian goods were rapidly converted into weapons manufacturing centers. Steel plants forged artillery barrels and armor plating. Chemical plants produced explosives and propellants. Assembly lines produced rifles and machine guns at unprecedented speed. The entire industrial capacity of many countries was redirected toward the war. In Germany, the massive industrial complex built by the Krupp family played a central role in supplying the nation's military forces. Krupp factories produced artillery, shells, and steel components that were essential for the German army. Their powerful cannons and heavy weapons became symbols of German industrial strength. The company's factories operated day and night to meet the enormous demand created by the war. Meanwhile, in Britain, companies such as Vickers expanded rapidly as the government increased military production. Vickers manufactured a wide range of military equipment, including machine guns, artillery pieces, and naval weapons. British shipyards also produced warships at an accelerated pace to strengthen the Royal Navy. In France, industrial companies like Schneider Creusot became vital suppliers of artillery and military equipment for French forces. French factories worked tirelessly to supply weapons needed for the brutal trench warfare that defined much of the conflict. The United States, which initially remained neutral, also saw its industrial sector expand as American companies supplied weapons and equipment to Allied powers. When the United States entered the war in 1917, its factories quickly shifted into full wartime production. Across the industrialized world, the scale of weapons manufacturing increased dramatically. Factories produced millions of rifles, allowing armies to equip vast numbers of soldiers. Machine guns, which had been relatively rare in earlier conflicts, became widespread on the battlefield. Artillery shells were produced in staggering quantities, as armies relied heavily on bombardments to weaken enemy positions. Artillery became one of the most devastating weapons of the war. Heavy guns could fire shells over long distances, destroying fortifications and causing massive casualties. Industrial production made it possible to manufacture enormous quantities of these weapons, and the ammunition required to operate them. At the same time, new technologies were emerging. Aircraft began appearing in the skies above the battlefield. Although early planes were simple reconnaissance machines, they soon evolved into fighters and bombers. Factories began producing aircraft engines, machine guns, and other components needed to support this new form of warfare. Chemical weapons also emerged during the conflict, introducing another terrifying dimension to the war. The scale of production required to support these technologies was unprecedented. Entire regions became centers of military manufacturing. Governments coordinated closely with industrial leaders to ensure that production targets were met. Workers in factories became as essential to the war effort as soldiers on the front lines. War had effectively become an industrial machine. This transformation had enormous economic consequences. Arms manufacturers experienced a surge in demand unlike anything they had seen before. Military contracts brought vast financial resources to companies, capable of producing weapons and equipment quickly and efficiently. Factories expanded, New production facilities were built, and thousands of workers were hired to support wartime manufacturing. Industrial companies connected to powerful families such as the Krupps in Germany, as well as major manufacturers in Britain and France, experienced enormous growth during this period. For these companies, the war created extraordinary economic opportunities. Weapons, ammunition, and military equipment were needed in vast quantities, and governments were willing to spend enormous sums to ensure their armies remained supplied. But the rise of the wartime arms industry also sparked controversy. As the conflict dragged on and casualties mounted into the millions, critics began questioning the relationship between industry and warfare. Some observers argued that companies benefiting financially from war might have incentives to support continued military expansion. In the years following the war, these concerns became even more visible. The scale of destruction during World War I shocked the world. Entire cities had been devastated. Millions of soldiers had died, and economies across Europe were deeply damaged. Many people began asking how such a catastrophic conflict had been possible. Part of the answer lay in the powerful industrial systems that had supported it. The factories that produced weapons in enormous quantities had made it possible for the war to continue for years. Without the industrial capacity to supply armies with weapons and ammunition, the conflict might have ended much sooner. Instead, industrial production had allowed the war to grow into one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. Yet even after the war ended in 1918, the arms industry did not disappear. In fact, it would soon enter another period of expansion. Because while many hoped that World War I would be the war to end all wars, the global tensions that had fueled the conflict had not truly disappeared. And in the decades that followed, the arms industry would continue to grow, preparing for an even larger and more devastating conflict that was still to come. When World War I finally ended in 1918, the devastation it left behind shocked the world. Millions of soldiers had died, vast regions of Europe had been destroyed, and entire societies were struggling to rebuild. In the aftermath of such destruction, many people believed that the world had learned a painful lesson. Political leaders spoke about the need for peace, international cooperation, and the prevention of future wars. Organizations such as the League of Nations were created in hopes of maintaining global stability and avoiding another catastrophe. For a moment, it seemed possible that the era of massive military production might come to an end. Many hoped that arms factories would shrink, military spending would decrease, and nations would focus instead on rebuilding their economies. But reality soon proved far more complicated. Although the war had ended, the global political landscape remained tense and uncertain. Borders had been redrawn, new nations had emerged, and old rivalries had not disappeared. Many governments feared that peace might be temporary. As a result, military planning continued. Rather than abandoning their armed forces, many nations began rebuilding and modernizing their militaries. The experience of World War I had demonstrated how important technology and industrial production were in determining the outcome of conflicts. Military leaders now believed that the next war would be even more dependent on advanced technology. This belief created new opportunities for the arms industry. During the 1920s and 1930s, military technology underwent significant changes. Engineers and military strategists began developing entirely new types of weapons that had not existed during earlier wars. One of the most important innovations was the tank. First introduced during World War I, tanks had proven capable of crossing difficult terrain and breaking through enemy defenses. In the years following the war, engineers improved their design, making them faster, more reliably, and more powerful. Armies around the world began investing heavily in armored vehicles. At the same time, military aviation was advancing rapidly. During World War I, aircraft had primarily been used for reconnaissance and limited combat roles, but technological improvements in engines, aerodynamics, and weapon systems soon made aircraft far more capable. By the 1930s, military planners were envisioning fleets of bombers and fighter planes that could reshape the nature of warfare. The development of these new technologies required sophisticated industrial manufacturing. Companies specializing in steel production, engineering, and mechanical design quickly adapted to these emerging markets. Factories that had once produced artillery and ammunition began expanding into the production of tanks, aircraft engines, armored vehicles, and advanced artillery systems. The arms industry was evolving. It was no longer limited to traditional weapons like rifles and cannons. It had become a high-technology sector, combining engineering innovation with large-scale industrial production. Throughout this period, major defense companies continued to grow. Industrial dynasties that had already accumulated wealth during World War I maintained their influence in the global economy. Companies linked to powerful families expanded their operations, invested in new technologies, and strengthened their relationships with governments. These companies often worked closely with military planners. Engineers collaborated with army officials to design new weapon systems that could give their countries strategic advantages. Governments funded research programs aimed at improving aircraft, vehicles, communications systems, and other military technologies. The relationship between industry and government became increasingly close. In many cases, defense companies relied on government contracts to finance their operations. At the same time, governments depended on private industry to supply advanced equipment for their armed forces. This partnership helped embed the arms industry deeply within national economies. Factories producing military equipment employed thousands of workers. Supply chains connected steel mills, chemical plants, machine shops, and engineering firms across entire regions. Even during periods of peace, large segments of the industrial workforce were involved in defense-related production. At the same time, global political tensions were quietly increasing. Economic instability during the Great Depression created widespread hardship and political unrest in many countries. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, new political movements emerged that emphasized nationalism and military expansion. These governments placed heavy emphasis on rebuilding and strengthening their armed forces. Military spending increased dramatically. Arms manufacturers once again found themselves in high demand. Factories expanded, research laboratories developed new weapons, technologies, and governments signed major defense contracts. The industry that had grown during World War I was now preparing for another period of rapid expansion. By the late 1930s, the world was once again entering a dangerous period of geopolitical tension. Factories were increasing production, and the global arms industry was once again becoming one of the most powerful forces within the international economy. The hope that World War I had been the war to end all wars was fading. Instead, the industrial systems that had supported the previous conflict were still in place and growing stronger. Soon, these factories would once again begin producing weapons on a massive scale, because within only a few years, the world would plunge into an even more destructive conflict, a war that would mobilize entire continents, transform the global balance of power, and push the industrial machinery of war to its absolute limits. It would become known as World War II. When World War II erupted in 1939, it pushed the industrial machinery of war to a scale far beyond anything the world had previously experienced. While World War I had already demonstrated the importance of industrial production in warfare, the second global conflict would take that reality even further. War was no longer simply supported by industry. It consumed entire economies across Europe, North America, and Asia. Governments reorganized their national industries around one central objective: producing the weapons needed to win the war. Civilian manufacturing slowed or stopped entirely as factories shifted toward military production. Automobile factories began producing tanks. Aircraft companies expanded their facilities to manufacture bombers and fighter planes. Steel plants focused on armor plating, artillery barrels, and ship construction. Entire nations were transformed into vast war economies. In the United States, the industrial mobilization was enormous. American factories produced staggering numbers of military vehicles and equipment. By the end of the war, the United States had manufactured tens of thousands of aircraft, tanks, and ships. The country's enormous industrial capacity allowed it to become one of the primary suppliers of military equipment for Allied forces. This production effort became known as the Arsenal of Democracy. In Britain, industrial workers labored tirelessly to produce aircraft, naval vessels, radar systems, and artillery, while the country faced the constant threat of air attacks. During the Blitz, British factories played a crucial role in maintaining the nation's defense against German forces. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Nazi regime placed enormous emphasis on expanding military production. Factories produced tanks, aircraft, submarines, and artillery for the German war machine. Industrial companies that had existed for decades, many connected to powerful industrial families, became central to this massive wartime economy. Companies such as Krupp, which had already built their reputation during earlier conflicts, expanded their production dramatically. German factories produced heavy artillery, armored vehicles, and other advanced weapons that played key roles in the early years of the war. The Soviet Union also mobilized its industrial resources on a massive scale. Factories were relocated eastward to avoid enemy attacks and continued producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in enormous quantities. Soviet industrial production became a decisive factor in sustaining the Red Army during the long conflict on the Eastern Front. Across all major powers involved in the war, the pattern was the same. Entire economies were reorganized around the needs of military production. Millions of workers, men and women alike, entered factories to build the machines of war. Assembly lines produced tanks, trucks, rifles, bombs, and ammunition at unprecedented speeds. Scientific research was also heavily directed toward military innovation. New technologies emerged that would change warfare forever. Aircraft became faster and more powerful. Radar systems improved the ability to detect enemy forces. Advanced submarines threatened shipping routes across the oceans. Toward the end of the war, the development of nuclear weapons introduced a new and terrifying level of destructive capability. Behind all of these developments stood powerful industrial organizations. Corporations and industrial families played central roles in supplying their nation's militaries. Their factories became essential components of the national war effort. Without the production capacity of these companies, sustaining such a massive global conflict would have been impossible. For some companies, the war brought enormous growth. Military contracts provided vast financial resources, allowing factories to expand rapidly. Industrial leaders gained significant influence as governments relied on them to maintain production and deliver advanced weapons systems. But this relationship between industry and war also created serious ethical questions. As the war progressed and the scale of destruction became increasingly clear, critics began asking difficult questions about the role of industry in fueling global conflict. If powerful corporations profited from the production of weapons, did this create incentives that encouraged continued militarization? These concerns became particularly intense after the war ended. Investigations revealed that some companies had cooperated closely with authoritarian regimes during the conflict. In certain cases, factories had used forced labor or participated in military production that directly supported aggressive expansionist policies. These revelations sparked international debates about corporate responsibility and the role of industrial power in wartime economies. At the same time, many industrial leaders defended their actions. They argued that their companies had simply fulfilled the needs of their nations during a time of existential conflict. Producing weapons, they said, had been necessary for survival in a world at war. Regardless of these debates, one reality had become undeniable. World War II had demonstrated the full power of industrial warfare. Modern conflict was no longer determined solely by battlefield strategy or the bravery of soldiers. It depended equally on factories, engineers, scientists, and industrial production. The companies that could produce the most tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons often held a decisive advantage. This realization would shape the global balance of power in the decades that followed. Because even after World War II ended in 1945, the relationship between industry and warfare did not disappear. Instead, it evolved into something even larger, a global system in which governments, corporations, and military planners became deeply interconnected, a system that would soon dominate the geopolitical landscape of the second half of the 20th century. It would be known as the Cold War, and it would launch the arms industry into a new era of unprecedented technological competition. When World War II ended in 1945, the world hoped that the devastation of the conflict would usher in a lasting era of peace. The war had destroyed cities, taken tens of millions of lives, and revealed the terrifying destructive potential of modern industrial warfare. But instead of peace, a new form of global rivalry soon emerged. Two powerful nations stood at the center of the post-war world: the United States and the Soviet Union. Both had played decisive roles in defeating Nazi Germany. Yet their political systems and strategic interests were fundamentally different. The United States represented a capitalist democratic system. The Soviet Union represented a communist state with centralized political control. As tensions between these two superpowers grew, the world entered a new era of geopolitical competition that would last for nearly half a century. This period became known as the Cold War, Unlike the world wars that preceded it, the Cold War was not defined by direct large-scale battles between the two superpowers. Instead, it was characterized by political rivalry, ideological conflict, proxy wars, and a relentless competition for military superiority. At the center of this competition stood the arms race. Both the United States and the Soviet Union believed that maintaining military dominance was essential for national security. Each side feared that falling behind technologically could leave them vulnerable to attack. As a result, both nations began investing enormous resources into developing new weapons systems. The most significant of these developments was the creation of nuclear weapons. The United States demonstrated the devastating power of atomic bombs in the final days of World War II. Only a few years later, the Soviet Union successfully developed its own nuclear weapon. This breakthrough marked the beginning of a dangerous new era. Nuclear weapons possessed destructive capabilities far beyond anything the world had previously seen. Entire cities could be destroyed in seconds. The possibility of global nuclear war became one of the most terrifying realities of the Cold War. Period. But nuclear weapons were only part of the story. Both superpowers began investing heavily in missile technology, capable of delivering nuclear warheads across vast distances. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, allowed weapons to be launched from one continent and strike targets thousands of kilometers away. Submarine-based nuclear weapons created another layer of strategic complexity, allowing countries to maintain hidden nuclear forces, capable of responding even after a surprise attack. This strategy became known as mutually assured destruction. The idea was grim but simple. If both sides possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other, neither side would dare launch a first strike. The balance of terror would, paradoxically, prevent global war. Maintaining this balance required enormous military investment. Throughout the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union poured vast resources into research, development, and production of advanced military technology. Aircraft capable of delivering nuclear weapons were developed, along with radar systems, satellites, and early computer technologies designed to manage complex defense networks. The defense industry expanded rapidly. Companies that produced aircraft, missiles, electronics, and advanced engineering systems became central to national security strategies. Governments relied heavily on private contractors and industrial corporations to design and manufacture the increasingly sophisticated technologies required for modern warfare. In the United States, companies such as Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, and General Dynamics became key players in the defense sector. These companies developed fighter jets, bombers, missile systems, and other advanced military technologies. Government contracts worth billions of dollars fueled the growth of the American defense industry. The Soviet Union, operating under a state-controlled economic system, also invested heavily in military production. Massive state-run industrial complexes produced tanks, aircraft, submarines, and missile systems designed to compete with Western capabilities. Across both superpowers, the relationship between governments and defense industries became deeply intertwined. Military planners depended on industrial expertise to develop new weapons systems. Industrial corporations relied on government contracts for financial stability and technological development. This relationship raised important concerns about the growing influence of the defense industry. One of the most famous warnings came from U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. In 1961, during his farewell address to the nation, Eisenhower spoke about what he called the military-industrial complex. He warned that the close relationship between government, the military, and powerful defense contractors could create a system in which military spending and arms production continued expanding beyond what was necessary for national security. Eisenhower did not argue that a strong military was unnecessary, but he cautioned that excessive influence from the defense industry could shape political decisions and national priorities in ways that might be difficult to control. His warning captured a growing concern. By the mid-20th century, the arms industry had become one of the most powerful sectors of the global economy. Defense spending accounted for enormous portions of national budgets, and the companies responsible for producing military technology wielded significant political and economic influence. Yet despite these concerns, the Cold War arms race continued for decades. Technological competition drove rapid innovation in fields ranging from aerospace engineering to nuclear physics and computer science. Some of these technologies eventually produced civilian benefits, including advances in space exploration, communications systems, and computing. But the underlying reality remained. The world had entered an era in which industrial power, technological innovation, and military competition were deeply interconnected. The arms industry had become a permanent feature of the global economy. And even when the Cold War eventually came to an end, the vast networks of defense companies and military institutions that had developed during this period would continue shaping international politics for decades to come. The business of war had evolved once again, becoming more technologically advanced, more global, and more powerful than ever before. In the 21st century, the arms industry has evolved into one of the most powerful and technologically advanced sectors of the global economy. What once began with small workshops forging swords and cannons has grown into a vast international network of corporations, research institutions, and government agencies dedicated to the development of military technology. Today, the global defense industry operates on a scale that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. Modern defense companies design and manufacture some of the most sophisticated machines ever created. Advanced fighter jets, guided missile systems, naval warships, satellite networks, and cyber defense platforms are all part of the modern military landscape. These technologies require enormous investments in engineering, research, and industrial production. As a result, the companies involved in the defense sector have become some of the largest and most influential corporations in the world. In the United States, companies such as Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon have become central players in the global arms industry. These corporations develop advanced aircraft, missile defense systems, and military electronics used by armed forces around the world. Lockheed Martin, for example, produces the F-35 fighter jet, one of the most technologically advanced aircraft ever developed. The program involves thousands of engineers, multiple international partners, and a vast supply chain stretching across numerous countries. Meanwhile, European defense companies such as BAE Systems, Airbus Defence and Thales have also become major players in the international arms market. These firms produce military aircraft, naval vessels, radar systems, and electronic warfare technologies. Russia and China have likewise developed large state-supported defense industries capable of producing advanced tanks, aircraft, missiles, and naval equipment. The result is a globalized defense sector in which companies compete for contracts from governments around the world. Governments remain the primary customers of the arms industry. Every year, nations spend enormous sums on military equipment and defense technology. Global military spending now reaches hundreds of billions of dollars annually, making defense one of the most financially significant sectors in the international economy. For government, maintaining advanced military capabilities is seen as essential for national security. Armed forces require modern equipment to respond to emerging threats, protect national borders, and maintain strategic influence. As a result, defense procurement programs often involve long-term investments in new weapons, systems, and technological research. But modern warfare is no longer defined solely by traditional weapons such as tanks and artillery. The battlefield has expanded into new technological domains. One of the most rapidly developing areas of military technology is cyber warfare. Governments now invest heavily in systems designed to defend against cyber attacks, targeting critical infrastructure, communications, networks, and national security systems. Artificial intelligence, autonomous drones, and satellite-based surveillance systems are also transforming modern military operations. Defense companies are increasingly involved in developing these advanced technologies. Research laboratories funded by defense contracts are exploring innovations in robotics, advanced computing, and space-based defense systems. Some of these technologies eventually find their way into civilian applications, influencing industries ranging from telecommunications to transportation. In many worlds, the relationship between military technology and technological innovation remains deeply intertwined. Throughout modern history, defense research has played a major role in driving scientific progress. Technologies such as the internet, GPS navigation, and advanced materials science all benefited from research originally funded through military programs. Yet the economic power of the defense industry also raises important questions. Critics argue that the enormous profits generated by arms production can create incentives that encourage continued military spending. They worry that powerful defense contractors may influence political decisions or lobbying efforts in ways that prioritize military expansion over diplomatic solutions. Supporters of the defense industry offer a different perspective. They argue that strong defense industries are essential for maintaining global stability and protecting nations from potential threats. Military technology, they say, acts as a deterrent that can prevent conflicts by ensuring that countries possess the capability to defend themselves. This debate reflects a long-standing tension in modern history. The same industries that produce weapons capable of destruction also drive technological innovation and economic growth. Despite these controversies, one fact remains clear. The global defense industry continues to expand. New geopolitical tensions, regional conflicts, and emerging security challenges ensure that governments remain heavily invested in military capabilities. Nations seek to maintain technological advantages that could determine the outcome of future conflicts. For defense companies, this environment creates continuous demand for new weapon systems and advanced technologies. Although the companies dominating the modern arms industry may appear very different from the industrial dynasties of the 19th century, their legacy is closely connected. The massive factories built by families such as the Krupps and the industrial empires that emerged during the World Wars helped establish the foundations of today's defense sector. Modern corporations may now operate on a global scale, but the basic principle remains the same. War and military preparation continue to drive industrial production, technological development, and enormous financial investment. The business of war has not disappeared. It has simply evolved, becoming more advanced, more interconnected, and more influential than ever before. And behind the modern defense industry still lies a historical story that stretches back more than 2 centuries. A story about power, technology, and the fortunes built from the machinery of conflict. As the global arms industry expanded over the past 2 centuries, it generated enormous wealth and technological progress. But alongside this growth came a deeply complex and enduring debate, one that continues to shape political discussions and public opinion even today. At the center of this debate lies a difficult ethical question. Can war ever truly be separated from the industries that profit from it? Throughout modern history, powerful corporations and industrial dynasties have played crucial roles in supplying governments with weapons and military technology. From the steel cannons of the 19th century to the advanced missile systems and aircraft of today, defense companies have provided the tools that armies depend upon. Without these industries, modern military forces would struggle to function. Supporters of the defense sector often emphasize this point. They argue that defense industries are essential for national security. In a world where geopolitical tensions and potential conflicts remain a reality, governments must maintain the ability to defend their citizens and protect their national interests. Modern militaries require advanced equipment, fighter jets, radar systems, cyber defense tools, naval fleets, and missile defense systems to deter potential threats. From this perspective, the defense industry performs a necessary and legitimate role. Weapons manufacturers provide governments with the tools required to maintain peace through strength. If nations possess strong and technologically advanced military capabilities, they may discourage potential aggressors from initiating conflict. Many political leaders and military strategists therefore view defense industries as a cornerstone of national security. Supporters also point out that military research has historically contributed to major technological breakthroughs. Throughout the 20th century, defense-funded research helped produce innovations that eventually transformed civilian life. Technologies such as radar, jet engines, GPS navigation, and even the internet were influenced by research originally funded through military programs. From this perspective, the defense sector does not only produce weapons, it also drives innovation that benefits society as a whole. Yet critics of the arms industry offer a very different perspective. They argue that when enormous profits are tied to military production, a troubling incentive structure can emerge. If companies generate significant financial gains from weapons manufacturing, critics worry that those companies may benefit when tensions increase or conflicts continue. The concern is not necessarily that defense companies directly cause wars. Rather, critics argue that a system in which powerful corporations profit from military spending can create political pressures that encourage continued investment in weapon systems even during times when diplomacy or peaceful solutions might be possible. This debate became particularly visible during the 20th century. In the years following World War I, many people began questioning whether arms manufacturers had contributed to the escalation of global tensions. Investigations in several countries explored whether industrial interests had influenced government policies during the years leading up to the war. Although these investigations did not produce simple answers, they revealed how closely industry and politics had become connected. Decades later, the debate resurfaced during the Cold War, as defense spending increased dramatically in both the United States and the Soviet Union. Critics began warning about the growing influence of defense contractors within national economies and political systems. The concept of the military-industrial complex, famously mentioned by President Dwight Eisenhower, captured these concerns. Eisenhower warned that the close relationship between governments, military institutions, and powerful defense companies could lead to a system in which military spending continued to grow beyond what was necessary for national security. His warning highlighted the potential dangers of allowing industrial power and political influence to become too closely linked. Today, this debate remains unresolved. Supporters of the defense industry continue to argue that strong military capabilities are essential for maintaining stability in an unpredictable world. They point to ongoing geopolitical tensions, regional conflicts, and emerging security threats as evidence that governments must remain prepared. At the same time, critics continue to question whether the enormous scale of global military spending is justified. Global defense budgets now total hundreds of billions of dollars each year, and the production of weapons remains a highly profitable industry. Some analysts argue that a portion of these resources could instead be directed toward addressing global challenges such as climate change, poverty, and public health. Yet finding a clear solution to this dilemma has proven difficult. Modern societies rely on complex systems of national defense, international alliances, and technological development. Completely separating industry from military production is unlikely in a world where security concerns remain significant. As a result, the ethical questions surrounding war profits continue to persist. They reflect a deeper tension within modern civilization. The same industries capable of producing extraordinary technological innovations are also capable of building weapons of immense destructive power. Balancing the need for security with the desire for peace remains one of the most challenging dilemmas facing the modern world. For more than 2 centuries, the rise of arms empires has forced societies to confront this uncomfortable reality. The business of war has shaped economies, technologies, and political systems across the globe. And the question of how that power should be managed remains one of the most important and unresolved debates of our time. The history of the global arms industry reveals a powerful and often uncomfortable truth. Behind every major war lies not only political decisions and military strategy, but also the immense machinery of industry. Weapons do not appear on battlefields by accident. Long before soldiers march into combat, vast networks of factories, engineers, and corporations have already begun the work of designing and producing the tools of war. Throughout modern history, powerful industrial families and corporations have played a central role in this process. From the steel empires of the 19th century to the advanced defense companies of the modern era, industrial dynasties helped build the weapons that shaped some of the most important conflicts in human history. Cannons, rifles, explosives, aircraft, missiles, and complex defense systems were all products of industrial innovation and large-scale manufacturing. For many of these families and companies, war created enormous economic opportunities. Military contracts generated immense wealth, allowing industrial empires to expand their factories, develop new technologies, and strengthen their influence within national economies. Over time, some of these dynasties became deeply connected to political power, financial networks, and strategic. Their influence extended far beyond the battlefield. Industrial leaders helped shape military planning, technological research, and even international diplomacy. In many cases, the factories that produced weapons became essential components of national power. Yet the legacy of these arms empires remains complex. Supporters argue that defense industries have been necessary for protecting nations and maintaining global stability. Critics, however, question whether the immense profits generated by war production create troubling incentives within the global system. Regardless of where one stands in this debate, one fact remains undeniable. In the modern world, war is not fought only by soldiers. It is also built in factories, designed in laboratories, and financed by powerful industrial networks. And the families and corporations who built those factories have played a profound role in shaping the history of modern warfare and the world we live in today.